Birds are pretty great. Did you know that due to the immense oxygen requirements of flying, they're basically all lung? Soon you'll know all kinds of bird facts. Because nothing calms my frazzled nerves at the end of a very long week better than spouting esoteric facts. And sake. Let's get right into it. So, birds can't really live in space. You can take them to space temporarily, but you'll run into issues once they need to drink something. You see, birds need gravity to swallow. Many animals have smooth muscle in their esophagus that allows them to pump the water down with peristalsis. But birds don't have that. They scoop up the water with their beaks, and then they stretch their necks up really high to get gravity to make the water trickle down. And that works great, except in 0G when you kind of need the peristalsis pumping. But there is one avian exception to this swallowing rule, and no, it's not the swallow. It's the pigeon. Colymbidae is the bird family of pigeons and doves, and for some reason, they've got swallowing muscles. So let's talk about pigeons. My Patreon sub, Caldo, pointed out to me that pigeons are really bad at making nests. It's kind of just the minimal attempt. It made me start to wonder what even qualifies as a nest. Lucky for me, there's a whole Wikipedia page just on bird nests, and the types include scrape, mound, burrow, cavity, cup, saucer or plate, platform, pendant, sphere. So then I tried to figure out which one a pigeon would be. Might be a scrape? I don't even think it's a depression, so no, not a scrape. Mound? No. Cavity? No. Cup? No. Saucer or plate? No. Like, I don't even think it's any of these, but I'll say it looks like scrape for now. And this made me wonder if maybe it had to do with domestication. You see, the pigeons you see in cities were actually formerly domesticated, not just tamed. And then they went feral. I think they're great, but apparently some cities would prefer not to have them everywhere. And they've come up with some pretty interesting solutions. One method is nicarbazine, which is a contraceptive that they use on pigeons and Canadian geese. We'll talk about Canadian geese later. But surprisingly, it doesn't seem to cause toxicity or reproductive issues in the predators of pigeons. So that's cool. Another method of pigeon control that did not seem to work so well was dummy egg nesting. There was a large pigeon loft at Bateman Park in Melbourne, and it was designed to be accessed at night when the pigeons were asleep. Sadly, it was removed in 2015 from a lack of success. But speaking of fake eggs, there are some birds who are brood parasites. Some birds, like cuckoos and cowbirds, actually lay their eggs in other birds' nests along with their eggs, forcing them to take care of their offspring. The bird cuckoo is the origin of the word cuckold. This forces the unsuspecting parents to put a usually disproportionate amount of effort into the false offspring and can reduce the chances of their offspring's success. I say unsuspecting, except that some birds have caught on. The Western Bonelli's warbler has a strong rejection response for very clearly fake eggs. In this study, researchers swapped the warbler's eggs with fake eggs of different sizes and materials. They found that when the false egg was small, the warblers would actually manage to remove it from the nest. But if the egg was too large, they would actually just desert the nest along with their offspring. The false plasticine eggs actually had some pretty intense holes made by the female warblers, attempting to puncture them or grasp them to eject them. A bird's reaction to the false egg is an adaptation to the parasitism. Birds that have evolutionarily not been the victims of brood parasitism generally don't actually reject weird or misshapen eggs. Sometimes eggs are just weird and misshapen, but still viable. But we'll talk about that later too. But the adaptation of rejecting eggs from birds who were hosts remains even if the parasitic birds have gone extinct. For example, Bohemian waxwings are not currently hosts for brood parasitism. However, according to this study, they still reject 100% of suspicious eggs. Now this is interesting because it suggests that since the host birds are able to adapt and identify the false eggs, this would potentially require the parasitic birds to become more and more specialized over time, their egg sizes and shapes converging with a specific host target. But not all host birds adapt by rejecting. According to the Mathia hypothesis, brood parasite eggs may be accepted by the host out of fear of retaliation. You see, there are some brood parasites who, when they realize their egg has been rejected, just destroy the whole nest in retaliation. So that sucks. But brood parasitism is not the only form of parasitism that birds engage in. Meet the parasitic jaeger. This bird was initially misnamed in a kind of hilarious way. Its genus name, Stercorarius, is Latin for of dung, because what the parasitic jaeger does is wait until seabirds are flying back from a successful hunting trip and then just harass them really intensely. The harassment is so intense that goop falls out of the sky. People used to think that that goop was the parasitic jaeger pooping, but no, it was the attacked bird vomiting up its meal. You see, the parasitic jaeger feeds on vomit, like a little baby bird. And that's called kleptoparasitism. Speaking of birds that were tragically misnamed, Patreon sub Ben Gimperling pointed out that no extant penguin is a true penguin. You see, in the 16th century, European explorers came across great hawks and called them penguins. But auks are now extinct, and penguins are not actually very closely related to them. A Germanic word for penguins is fettgans, or fat goose. Some penguins live in very cold places, and it's actually kind of impressive that they can survive despite how small they are. Their surface area to volume ratio is not great, so they compensate for it in some interesting ways. For one, their feathers have feathers. Their wings, which are particularly thin because they're used as flippers, actually have a plexus of arteries and veins, which can redirect heat back to their core. Some penguins, like king penguins or emperor penguins, just don't even build nests. Instead, they just tuck the eggs and chicks between their feet. Speaking of shitty nests, the oilbird actually just makes its nest out of droppings. Oilbirds are pretty cool. They live in caves, and they're pretty good at seeing in low light environments. They have the highest light gathering capacity of any bird, and their retina is dominated by rod cells at the highest density of any vertebrate eye, and are organized in an arrangement that is unique among birds, but shared by deep sea fish. And even though they can see pretty well in the dark, they also are adapted to use echolocation. They make a series of sharp audible clicks. Speaking of interesting information transfer, I really like starlings. They have really interesting and complex vocalizations where they can embed sounds from their environments, but they also have this strange dramatic swarming behavior called murmuration. A murmuration is where the starlings all fly together and form all kinds of complex patterns, all moving together, coordinated. Now, murmurations are fascinating because the birds are reacting to each other, making dramatic changes in direction and acceleration as a group, seemingly instantly. The question is, how does the information for how the group moves transfer between the birds? The birds surely can't keep track of the movements of every other bird. How do they stay together? Luckily, physicists have plotted the position and speed of birds as they flocked, and made a mathematical model to identify the optimal number of flock mates for each bird to track. And that number is 7. Each bird keeps track of 7 other individuals, and in this way, the information flows through the flock. Speaking of birds all changing together, Patreon sub Carl Bunker let me know that the white-throated sparrow is changing its song. Basically, most birds have a distinctive call, but for some reason, over the last 2 decades, the white-throated sparrows across western and central Canada have been changing their song. It apparently started in British Columbia and is spreading east. And now, most of Canada's birds are singing it. So here's the old song. And here's the new song. And we don't really know why. Speaking of weird calls, the eastern screech owl has a call that sounds like the whinny of a miniature horse. The eastern screech owl also has some of the weirdest commensalism I've ever seen. They put live, blind snakes in their nests. Some of the snakes are eaten, but most live in the nest debris, where they eat soft-bodied insect larvae from the decomposer community in fecal matter, pellets, and uneaten prey. So that's pretty weird. Speaking of weird animal associations, this brings me to one of my favorite families of birds, Corvidae. Corvids are so great. Ravens and wolves actually work together. Ravens will fly around looking for injured or young animals, and when they find one, will alert the wolves to their presence, so the wolves can go in for the kill. Apparently, even when they're not hunting, ravens just like hanging around wolves. They'll play with cubs, they'll mess with their tails, and I think this is pretty well known. But corvids are super smart. Their brain-to-body mass ratio is similar to cetaceans, and only slightly less than humans. They pass the mirror test, they understand geometry, they can use tools. They're also the most frequently mentioned birds in heavy metal songs. Speaking of metal, let's talk about the great gray shrike. This bird is so cool. It's a predatory songbird, and it doesn't have all the adaptations of raptors, like its feet are kind of wimpy, but its beak is really intense. It kills its prey by swooping in and stabbing their skulls. But this predatory songbird doesn't just prey on animals as large as a young stoat. It takes its prey and it impales it on thorns or barbed wire, creating a sort of larder. Now you might think to yourself, well, a larder, that's gonna sound pretty tempting to a lot of animals. But the shrike is smart enough to spread the noxious chemicals from certain grasshoppers and locusts through the larder, discouraging thieves. I first learned about the shrike from reading the book Hyperion, and it's been one of my favorites ever since. The shrike historically used to be the host of a cuckoo, but not anymore. So despite the huge range of creatures that birds can consume, you may have noticed they're generally lacking in teeth. So the question might become, how do you break down the prey? Patreon sub Josh Brooks pointed out that the crop is really this weird mix of stomach, teeth. It's kind of like a muscular stomach with sharp things in it that contracts and grinds up the food. In layman's terms, gizzard chews the food for the bird because it does not have teeth to chew food the way humans and other animals do. But where do the sharp things come from? Well, birds eat those too, like rocks. They're called gastroliths and are sometimes worn smooth. One bird that has a particularly interesting diet is the bearded vulture, also known as a lammergeier. This vulture is an ossifrage, meaning that it eats bones. And not only does it eat bones, but 70 to 90% of its diet is bones. The acid in the stomach of the bearded vulture has a pH of approximately 1. Large bones can be digested in about 24 hours. And you might be thinking, bones, those dry, hard things? Where are they getting the calories? But it turns out that the calories in the fat of the bone marrow are about the same from what the bird would get from eating soft tissue. This allows this vulture to survive in an area with a low availability of carcasses. Skeletons effectively preserve themselves by dehydrating, which prevents bacteria from breaking them down. The bearded vulture can consume the skeleton for calories even months after animals have picked clean the original carcass. For bones that are too big for the vulture to swallow, they'll just fly them up really high and drop them on rocks. They can fly with bones that are nearly equal to their own weight. Vultures and other scavengers generally have some really interesting adaptations to allow them to eat dead things, but sometimes, historically, they've been fed intentionally. Patreon sub Dan Engler pointed me to the concept of sky burial. This is a funeral practice in Tibet where a human corpse is placed on a mountaintop to decompose, allowing it to be exposed to the elements and eaten by scavengers, especially carrion birds like vultures and corvids. Sky burial is the Western term, and Tibetans call it giving alms to the birds or to carry to the mountain. This actually makes a lot of sense because Tibet is mostly above the tree line, meaning there's not a lot of fuel in order to cremate anything, and the ground is a lot of rock and not a lot of soil, and even if there is soil, it's probably permafrost. According to Buddhist belief, it is a bad omen if only a small number of vultures come down to eat, if portions of the body are left over after the vultures fly away, or if the body is left completely untouched. Such cases are believed to reflect badly upon the deceased, indicating that they may have lived a bad life or accumulated bad karma, thus predetermining them to a bad rebirth. Often there is a limit to how many corpses can be consumed at a certain burial site. It is believed that if too many corpses are disposed of in a certain burial site, ghosts may appear. The species of vulture that generally contribute to this ritual are the Himalayan and griffin vultures. Now these vultures are interesting because they're not actually capable of sustained flapping flight. They're actually extremely lazy flyers, but in a really cool way because they are very effective at leveraging thermals. Most birds, when they fly, will elevate their basal metabolic rate to like 16 times their baseline, but these vultures can get away with only like 1.4 their baseline. In terms of being lazy, or maybe just really not lazy, Patreon sub Bailey Williams pointed out that there are some birds that can fly by shutting off half their brain at a time. So I looked into this more, and apparently the alpine swift can actually fly for 200 days non-stop. Sometimes their eyes will actually be open while they're sleeping. So yeah, some birds don't need to stop flying to sleep. Some birds don't even need heads. Let's talk about chickens. Mike the headless chicken was a chicken who managed to survive a beheading, mostly because it kept his brainstem intact and he didn't bleed to death due to a blood clot. He survived an additional 18 months and was fed with an eyedropper. So Mike's interesting because his brainstem being intact allows basic functions like breathing, heart rate, etc. But the question is, how is he able to walk around? Well, it turns out that birds have a balancing organ called the lumbosacral organ, which exists in the pelvic region. It controls walking locomotion, and it's weirdly pretty separate from the vestibular system, or the inner ear, that birds use for flying. So yeah, he could just kind of walk around. Poor Mike. We don't generally think about where domesticated animals came from, but chickens came from the red jungle fowl. The jungle. Yeah, it wasn't what I was thinking. The red jungle fowl is a species of tropical terrestrial birds found in Southeast and South Asia. It also just kind of looks like a chicken. So I mentioned with the brood parasites that it's not necessarily advantageous to get rid of weird eggs because sometimes weird eggs are viable. And what I learned on backyardchickens.com is actually that there are a lot of really common problems with eggs. According to them, 2% of all chicken eggs have some defect, ranging from minor, barely noticeable faults to downright alarming deformities. I found the common eggshell quality problems pretty interesting. White banded egg, blood on eggshell, body checked egg, broken and mended egg, misshapen or odd-shaped eggs, calcium deposits, lack of pigment or uneven pigmentation on eggshells, calcium coated egg. It's speckled eggs, shell-less eggs, slab-sided or flat-sided eggs, wrinkled eggs, corrugated shell, yolkless eggs, aka fart eggs, fairy eggs, witch egg, rooster egg, or oops egg. They're just really tiny. I really liked this article. I'm not sure how many of these eggs would have actually been viable where they fertilized, but I don't know, I can see why not abandoning an egg might be a good idea, at least until you know if it's hatched. And finally, my last and current favorite bird, the kagu. The kagu gets the award of sexiest bird. The kagu doesn't fly, so it currently only lives on the main island of Gran Terre in New Caledonia. So being very isolated has given it some particularly interesting characteristics. So the kagu is a carnivore that feeds on all kinds of bugs, lizards, insects, but it actually uses its beak to dig them out. So the kagu is the only bird to have nasal corns, which are these structures that cover its nostrils. So I have a personal hypothesis as to why the kagu has these nasal corns, because lots of birds dig, and they don't necessarily have their nostrils covered. So my theory is that Gran Terre actually has like a lot of lead in the soil. There are some parts of the island that the kagu can't even live because the levels of lead are too high. So maybe the nasal corns are there to prevent lead poisoning from the soil? Another weird characteristic of the kagu is its blood. It has 1/3 as many red blood cells and 3 times more hemoglobin per red blood cell than other birds. But yeah, I hope you find these bird facts as enjoyable as I found the experience of collecting them. Bonus questionable Reddit story. So birds don't have capsaicin receptors, which is how they're able to eat super hot chilies. The goal of the plant that made the chilies was probably that specifically birds would eat them, such that their seeds would get carried all over the place. So some brands of birdseed are actually treated with capsaicin to prevent squirrels and other mammals from eating them. So I read this Reddit story one time about a wedding where, like, sometimes at weddings when people leave the reception at the end, like, people throw birdseed. And in this particular story, they had accidentally bought the capsaicin birdseed. And so when they threw it up into the air, it was, really unpleasant for everyone. So this isn't exactly related to birds, but Patreon sub Wellen Inspector pointed out that in the platypus, which is a mammal that kind of looks like a bird, apparently there's a meiotic chain of 10 sex chromosomes that share genes with bird Z. So yeah, that's pretty weird. Bonus confession. So when I look at animals, I don't really look at them and think, that looks tasty, I want to eat that. Like, I look at a burger and I'm like, that looks good. But like, I don't look at a cow and say, like, I want to take a bite of that. But there's one exception, and that's Canadian geese. Whenever I look at a Canadian goose, I think to myself, that looks edible, right? Like, okay, maybe this is just me, but it looks like food. It's got this long, lanky little neck and a big, tasty looking body. I don't know, it's the only animal that just looks like food to me. So I wrote a poem about them. A goose is loose, but what's the use of geese I hark out in the park? Their necks are slim, I have a whim to grab and eat upon the street, then carry back that massive snack and have a feast of tasty geese. The fish and game rules are so lame. For now I'll glower, but not devour. Thank you.